Welcome everyone to Plastics Frontiers webinar series. The Plastics Frontiers webinar series was developed by the collaboration between the Royal Australian Chemical Institute, Society of Plastics Engineers Australia New Zealand and Society of Chemical Industry. We are thankful for the sponsorships from BSF Australia, Reckitt Benckiser, Qenos and Foundry Intellectual Property. For any concerns, please reach out to RACI. We are also thankful to the organising committee, Gary Bowman, Chair of RACI Industrial Chemistry and Dr. Yvonne Ma, Han Michel, President of the Society of Plastics Engineers Australia New Zealand and Dr. Steve Petanakis, Jenny Sharwood, OAM of the Victorian Education Committee for RACI and Dr. Richardthwaite, also Chair of Society of Chemical Industry. The purpose of the series is to highlight the continually evolving role and important contributions of plastics in society, some key societal and environmental issues faced by the plastics industry, and how the industry is rising to these challenges with new innovations and practices. With our backgrounds in education, industry, and academia, we are reaching out to as many sectors ranging from secondary chemistry teachers and students to researchers and innovators in industry and in universities. We hope you enjoy this series. Thank you for watching.
Excellent. Well, my task, I'm Richardthwaite, and my task, oh, hang on, click this. There we go. Yeah, my task is to chair the session in this series of Plastics Frontiers webinars today. Now, I'd like to welcome everyone and to acknowledge the original custodians of the land, in my case, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I'd encourage others to do so too. Good. I'd also like to acknowledge our generous sponsors for this evening who've given their support to ensure the success of these webinars, namely BASF, Reckitt Benckiser, Qenos and Foundry Intellectual Property Proprietary Limited, patent attorneys. This is the 8th webinar in our Plastics Frontiers series, with today's subtitle and focus being Solving the Challenges in Packaging. And we have 3 very distinguished speakers today who will be addressing the subject from a number of different perspectives. And we're very grateful to each of them for being willing to talk to us today. Each will speak for around 20 to 25 minutes, after which there'll be time for a panel discussion. So I'll ask everyone to be on mute, other than our speakers, of course, during the presentations. But can I encourage people, if you do have a question, to type it into the Q&A box at the foot of the screen, and my organising committee colleagues and I will have access to these, and we'll do our best to address as many as possible during the course of the evening. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Jane Paramore, Sustainability Partnership Manager at the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, APCO, a role which she has held for close to 2.25 years, responsible for the delivery of Australia's 2025 Sustainable Packaging Targets. Prior to this, she was Deputy Director of the Boomerang Alliance, having responsibility for leading the development and implementation of strategic planning across the organisation, ranging from grassroots community campaigning to high-level political advocacy, particularly focusing on developing sustainable approaches to addressing the growing waste crisis gripping Australia and the world. Jane started her career delivering analytical market research tools and services to the consumer packaged goods industry in Australia, Europe, and Latin America, working with some of the world's largest retailers and manufacturers. Then, after a summer job working aboard an Antarctic expedition vessel, don't quite know how she managed to get there, but there we go, Jane decided to make the professional leap to environmental sustainability, focusing in more recent times on plastic waste and pollution and the impact it is having on the environment and the health of the oceans. Jane has degrees from the University of Adelaide, the University of South Australia, and more recently, the University of Technology, Sydney, where she completed a Masters of International Law, focusing on environmental law. Jane is very well qualified to speak at our seminar this evening, and her topic is Building a Circular Economy for Packaging in Australia. So please join with me in giving Jane a warm virtual welcome. Thank you, Jane.
Richard, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Let me just share my slides, and I'm hoping that everybody can see what looks a bit like an old vinyl record up on the screen in front of them. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to be with you this evening, and I am very grateful to the organisers for inviting APCO along to join you and talk a little bit about packaging circularity in Australia. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I reside and work. I live on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, right in First Nations heartland in Redfern in Sydney. So I am daily touched by my First Nations compatriots and feel very enriched by that. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to talk to you a little bit tonight about the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation and the role that we play in driving a circular economy for packaging in Australia. I'm going to give you a bit of a high-level coverage of that topic tonight. The first thing that I want to have a little look at is the collective impact model that APCO operates under in terms of driving a sustainable packaging agenda across the Australian landscape. And I want to take a little look at the national packaging targets and how we're tracking against those at the moment in terms of achieving our objectives by 2025. So let's get into it. We've only got a short period, so we'll throw ourselves in the deep end. So I work for an organisation called the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, which is a national not-for-profit organisation, and we lead the development of a circular economy for packaging in Australia. So when we talk about packaging, we're talking about primary, secondary and tertiary packaging made from paper and fibre, cardboard, glass, metal, wood, compostable materials as well have a place in that space. And of course, more recently, we're seeing a return to reusable packaging. And this is becoming quite a movement across the packaging landscape, particularly in consumer goods areas. So this is an exciting shift that we're starting to see. So APCO is primarily responsible for supporting industry that places packaging materials onto the Australian market. We assist our members to meet regulatory obligations which are outlined in the National Environment Protection Measure for used packaging materials. Did you know we had one of them? It's a framework model that requires businesses putting packaging into the marketplace to report on their packaging use and to show progress towards improving packaging sustainability within their packaging profiles. We fondly refer to that act as the NEPM, or the regulation as it is as the NEPM. The NEPM also outlines the Australian Packaging Covenant, which is a voluntary product stewardship arrangement. It is an agreement between industry and government to improve packaging sustainability outcomes across the country. So businesses can choose to either join APCO as a member and have access to some amazing resources that we provide to our members that support them in achieving their reporting and planning obligations, that support them in working on their packaging profiles and changing the outcomes of their packaging across their ranges and packaging usage. Or alternatively, businesses that do not come to the covenant still have those obligations sitting outside of the covenant, and they are obliged to report that information to state and territory jurisdictions in which they sell their products and use their packaging. So there are obligations in the marketplace that apply to anybody that uses packaging in Australia. So we work closely with our members to provide them all the support that they need in order to deliver those objectives, but we're very much more than that. Since 2017, which was the latest iteration of the covenant, we worked to crystallise a very clear vision on how to deliver a circular economy for packaging, and we focus on three key areas. The first is design. What you're putting into the system needs to be the right materials in order to improve the outcomes for it at its end of use. We also look at the improvement of recovery and collection systems, so improvements to curbside, development of schemes to deal with problematic materials or materials that are not necessarily captured by conventional systems. And at the end of that process, we work on looking at end markets for the recovered materials that we collect through the system to make sure that there is a purchaser for that stuff at the end when it comes out. No point collecting it if you don't have somebody to buy it at the end of the pipe. It's not a charity, and businesses are looking to maintain a profitable model here. So you need to have a customer at the end of the day. So if you'd like to know more about APCO's vision and strategic approach, we've released a document in 2020 called Our Packaging Future, which provides a very clear outline as to how we need to get to the objectives that we have set ourselves for 2025. So just running through those four areas that we focus on: packaging design, systems, and material circularity to end markets. We also focus in on education, and we were just having a chat before the session started this evening as to the importance of that element within the mix. We try very hard to make sure that the necessary educational tools and resources are there and available to the people that need to use them. We work under what we call a collective impact model, I should say. Now, we as an organisation have a very good understanding of the marketplace, the systems that exist within the marketplace, but we cannot make the changes that are necessary. We need to bring all those participants along what we call the packaging value chain together in order to be able to create the solutions that we need to deliver on the outcomes that we're aiming for. So we are what we would call in that model a backbone organisation. We are the mechanism by which these conversations happen. We have a set of mutually reinforcing activities that contribute towards our common agenda, and that is improvements in packaging sustainability across the Australian landscape. We also maintain the measurement side of things, so we keep a material flow, which we will be reporting on very shortly. We've done 2 years in a row, and we're just about to release the details from our 3rd year, so we can see exactly how we're tracking towards our objectives. And we maintain a communication structure that enables us all to talk to one another regularly through working group structures and regular participatory meetings amongst our members, so that we all know what we're working towards and how we're going to get there. So when I say that packaging value chain, it's a big beast. This was one of the pieces that we did in the early stages of the work that we've been doing over the last few years, just to understand what a circular economy for packaging would look like. And as you can see, the central part of that circle describes all the stages in a packaging life cycle, I guess, from go to woe, and also bringing that material back into the market for another round. And at each of those nodes, I guess, along that circle, we've identified who those participants are. And we have a good understanding of what role they play in the value chain across the economy. So we draw upon that group to fill what we call our advisory groups. And this set of groups has actually grown over the last few years, and we're just about to launch into a new set for the 2021-22 financial year. But basically what we do is we focus in on the strategic approach that we have developed through our Packaging Future, and we create working groups to inform us. We are not a prescriptive organisation. We are an organisation that understands through our networks what is going on in the marketplace, and we reflect that back to our brand owners and to our members to enable them to make informed decisions on packaging. So we work very closely right across industry to understand the challenges, the opportunities, what we need to do to rectify the system as it is at the moment and move it towards what we're looking for in that circular model. So that's all, as I said, been crystallised in our Packaging Future. And that document is available for public access through our website. You can get your hands on that if you would like to have a little look. It has some very detailed information about what's going on in the Australian landscape. And out of that, we developed 3 key strategies in order to address the packaging circularity issue that we were faced with. The first of those, as I mentioned, is around design. And we have a number of strategies there that we are undertaking in order to achieve improved design of materials coming into the system in the first place. In the middle, you can see we are looking at the collection and recycling systems, and we have also a number of strategies there that enhance the existing systems that we have in place and look at other opportunities, particularly in areas like business-to-business packaging, how we can improve recovery of materials in those kinds of contexts, looking at some of those nuanced materials that aren't covered by conventional collection systems, and educating people how to do the right thing with their waste when they get to the point of disposal. And on the third strategy there, again, looking at expanded markets, we need to have people buying these materials and putting them back into useful applications. We are working very carefully and cleverly towards that as we go forward. And I think chemical engineering particularly has a very big part to play in that role as we move towards creating these materials that are good feedstocks and good materials to go back into packaging applications. So over the last few years, we've done quite a lot of work, and that really is just a snapshot of all the bits and pieces that we've been up to. We are in the throes of doing a lot more. We have a number of projects on the go at the moment around things like recycled content labelling, the expansion of our Australasian recycling label, which I'll talk about in a second, to incorporate compostable packaging into that mix as well. We are looking at reuse models and how to promote those around the marketplace. We are operating a number of product stewardship initiatives as well for particularly problematic materials like black plant pots that are used in horticultural applications. The problem with those is, of course, the pigmentation that is used that makes them very difficult to process. So we're looking to address that through alternative collection models. We're also working on soft plastics guidance for companies in the Australian marketplace, creating soft plastics to ensure that they are acceptable through our recovery and reprocessing systems here in Australia. So the work doesn't stop, it's still going on. And as I was saying to Richard and the other panelists earlier, we are seeing that momentum. I think people are beginning to understand what the landscape looks like at the moment. And we're seeing that momentum speed up in terms of delivering these objectives. So it's a very exciting space to be in at the moment. I wanted to reference, and I know that this has been touched on in one of your other sessions, but I think one of the things we talked about was the need for education and understanding of the complexities of the systems that we're dealing with here. The example you see in front of it was actually a project born during a visit that APCO organised for some of our board members up to look at some material recovery facilities and some advanced recycling technologies on the Central Coast here in New South Wales. And one of our board members at the time was with Nestle, she still is, and she got a little thought into her head that she'd like to create a pilot to prove that they could actually recycle soft plastics from local household collections. So this gives you an idea of the complexity of the system. All the brands that you see across the screen in front of you there, and I know Richard's on the line and we'll be speaking in a moment about this as well, potentially. There are so many players in that mix. It is a very complex system that needs to be implemented in order to address some of these recycling challenges that we have. But there are enormous opportunities, and particularly in this space where we were looking at chemical recycling for soft plastics, it was a fantastic example of being able to use that chemical recycling technology to return materials to the highest value they could possibly be used at in the marketplace once again. I won't go into that in too much detail. I will leave that for others to talk about. But I guess the other thing that I wanted to mention was the 2025 national packaging targets, which are underpinning all the work that we do. At the beginning of, I think it was 2018, the government endorsed the national packaging targets in partnership with APCO. And as you can see those on screen, there are 4 of them. The 100% target really underpins everything. If we can make sure that everything that's coming into the system is either recyclable, reusable or compostable, then we're halfway to fixing the problem, because at least we know that those materials are actually fit for recapture, recovery and remanufacture into new materials. The 70% of plastic packaging being recycled or composted, that's a challenging one. Plastic is our problem child, you might say. But again, we're seeing incredible advances in terms of recycled content technology, bringing these materials back into very high grade uses. And while we thought that was a very difficult target when we first set it, again, that cascading impact that things are having at the moment are leading us down a path that looks like that is going to be much more achievable than we initially thought. The 50% average recycled content measure was actually increased after our first year of tracking what was going on in the marketplace. We realized that we already had hit that mark. We had 33% recycled content across the marketplace. So through a bit of industry consultation with all our stakeholders, we felt confident that we could actually raise that to 50%. And there has been very strong support for driving that objective further. And we're also looking at problematic and unnecessary single-use plastic packaging. We're looking at some of those materials like expanded polystyrene, which we have very small volumes. They are very difficult materials to recycle in the Australian market because of our size. Again, geography is a problem, the cost of collecting and recovering that material, and a lack of end markets for the reprocessed material in the Australian context means that that's one of those items that's being phased out. We released an action plan around a number of different materials that have been identified under that phase out target at the end of last year. And again, that's available up on the APCO website if people would like to know more about that. In terms of how we're tracking, while we've been doing all this study to understand where we are and what we're doing, we have seen that there has been incremental improvement over the first couple of years that we have been working on this issue. Certainly down the left-hand side, you can see the targets themselves. The lighter part of the bar there is representative of the first year that we actually conducted a material flow analysis to understand what was going on. And the darker bar is the improvement we saw just in 1 year based on the work that we've been doing around understanding what was going on in the landscape and providing some of that initial guidance to people as to how they could address these issues. So it's been a really positive outcome with the amount of effort that we've put in so far. That effort continues, and we're very much anticipating a significant improvement in these areas over the next few years. We also have great responsibility under the National Waste Policy Action Plan. And even more recently, I won't leave you dwelling on that one, more recently probably is the National Plastics Plan, which was launched in March. And of course, one of the main issues in that list of actions that they're looking for is that 80% of supermarket products will display the Australasian recycling label by 2023. So we talk about education and we talk about behaviour change. This is one of the very primary tools that we have in play at the moment, which can support that process. The ARL has been in the marketplace for about 3 years now. We are already seeing it on around 25% of supermarket products, and it's expanding out into a much broader range of products as well. I see it very regularly appearing in places I haven't seen it before, so it's certainly popping up all over the place. Last year we were called out by the United Nations Environment Programme as one of 2 exemplary programs based on the evidence base that underpins the label, which is calibrated to the Australian marketplace in terms of recyclability of materials and end markets for the recycled content. So it's a two-pronged, in fact, it's multi-layered, but it is very much reflective of what we can do here in Australia. And the instruction is simple. It is basic stuff that people can understand easily and readily, and it's there in front of them at the point of disposal when they get rid of their packaging. So we're seeing enormous changes in that area at the moment. The government support for that will see a much greater rollout happen in the next few years. We've also just launched the Australian, New Zealand and Pacific Plastics Pact, which is part of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation network of plastics pacts around the world. So we're going to be able to leverage a lot of international experience in that context as well, and bring a lot of that knowledge that's going on in other jurisdictions, specifically around plastics, to the Australian and the Pacific market and New Zealand as well. So we think that's going to be a bit of a game changer over the next couple of years, and we're very excited to be involved in that. And I guess one of the biggest things is really we are a place of resource. If people are looking for information about packaging, if they want to understand what the nuances are of the Australian marketplace, the difference between technical recyclability and actual recyclability in Australia, there is a wealth of information on our website that can support that kind of knowledge gathering. And our biggest guidance for people is please just come to us if you have questions, if you want to talk about packaging sustainability, if you want to know what's going on in the marketplace. We're a bit of a one-stop shop, and we are keen to talk to anybody that's interested in having these sorts of discussions, because we've got a lot of work to do. And ultimately, we need everybody to come along on the path with us. So we're there for support and help and assistance, and happy to take any questions that anybody might have about that.
Well, thank you, Jane, for a most stimulating, interesting and impressive presentation. APCO is an organisation that I didn't really know very much about before your presentation. But can I just ask, and I don't see any other questions and answers put up by any of our audience members yet, but can I just ask, how big is APCO? What's its budget? You said in one of your slides, I think you've got about 1,500, maybe you started with just under 1,000 members, you've got 1,500 members now. What's the budget and what's the head count in APCO?
Yes, okay. Well, the budget is basically based on how many members we have. We have what we call a sliding, well, it is a sliding, it's not called a sliding membership structure. It is based on annual turnover, and it starts from the smallest member if you have under 5 million in turnover a year, you can join APCO for $500 as an annual fee, or it goes all the way up to businesses that are over 50 billion. So we work through a number of tiers there. Based on how many people are working with us, then that is really what governs our budget annually. We don't receive funding from government as a rule. We do have to, if we want government funding, go out like everybody else and apply for it. And And in the last couple of years, we've had a bit of funding for a few projects around things like the product stewardship initiatives I mentioned. We've had some other work, some funding come through for a couple of other projects around remote and regional access to better waste collection and things like that. So we are like every other player in the market in that respect, that if we do get support from government, it is generally as part of a broader funding offering that they have for us. And we just use our members' fees to primarily support them to deliver on their objectives, and also to, I guess, work on that circularity, because really APCO is the only organisation I think that sits in this sort of position and is able to facilitate a lot of this work really at the moment. So yeah, it's a
Right.
movable feast to a degree.
Thanks for that. Now, we do have a question from Bill Verhagen. With the federal government regulations on plastics exports starting to take effect on the 1st of July this year and the 1st of July next year, how well positioned are we to handle the 80% of recovered plastics that are currently exported? This seems to me to be a huge issue requiring massive increased capacity in recycling capacity. Would you like to comment, Jane?
Absolutely. The government is doing a lot in this space. You may have heard of the Recycling Modernisation Fund. Now, this was an announcement from the Commonwealth Government, and the funding has also been mirrored in the state and territory jurisdictions. So there is an enormous amount of work going on. I'm on the New South Wales Government's planning newsletter, and I get regular information about planning applications coming through for new reprocessing facilities and advanced recycling facilities. We're seeing a lot of development going on in that space at the moment. So I feel very comfortable that there is a lot of money floating around in the marketplace that will support the transition that we need. It will take a couple of years to get there because, of course, these are large capital expenditure projects that need to be put in place. But we're also seeing things like improvements to material recovery facility technology at the moment already. We're seeing support for some of the advanced recycling technologies that are out in the marketplace. So yeah, it is a big task, but they're certainly pushing in the right direction, and government is very much supporting that across the board.
Well, thank you, Jane. I think perhaps we'll call that to a halt at the moment. There's more opportunities for questions and discussion later on. So please will everyone join with me virtually in thanking Jane for the presentation. Okay, and we will now move on, I think, to our second speaker today, Alan Adams, Sustainability Director for the Asia Pacific region for Sealed Air Corporation. Now, Sealed Air is a company which describes itself as bringing together packaging materials, equipment, services and automation to provide essential protection for products and people, and driving towards sustainable packaging solutions. The company specialises in packaging for the food industry and the like, and I'm sure Alan will tell us a bit more about what the company does and the challenges it faces. Now, Alan is a seasoned veteran of the packaging industry, having had more than 25 years in the industry. Based in Melbourne, he leads customer and packaging industry engagement with sustainable packaging allied to retail trends. He's a founding member and former president of the Australasian Bioplastics Association and is an active member of the Australian Institute of Packaging, and most recently was named as the Industry Professional of the Year in the 2021 Australasian Packaging Innovation and Design Awards. Now, winning that award is a bit like winning an Oscar, I guess, but probably without the hype and the glitz. More a reward for doing an outstanding job in the industry over many years. And I think the competition for the prize was pretty tough. I understand Alan has a degree from the University of Waikato in New Zealand, which itself describes itself as being for people who want to stand out and fit in, which is interesting. This probably means that Alan's a Kiwi, but we won't hold that against you, Alan. Rather, I think we'll all give you a very warm welcome to our webinar today. And I think the title of your presentation is Reimagining the Future in Plastics Packaging, or something like that, isn't it? So, Alan, over to you.
Richard, thanks so much for the introduction. I sense that the number of years you need to be in the industry to qualify for some of those awards means that the pool is getting smaller. So it's kind of been a longevity, outlive approach, to be honest. Look, yes, I would like to share some views of the future of packaging, and what a exciting time to be in the packaging industry. So let me share my screen and give you some thoughts about it from my own perspective and from RACI Sealed Air's perspective. Hopefully you can all see that nice and clearly. Yeah, what a time to be in packaging, and what a time to be in plastics. Never have we seen so much change in such a short period of time. And I sense that with the three speakers on the panel today, Jane, myself and Richard, you're going to hear some recurring themes, which should be reassuring about the strength of the industry and the way forward. So just for a little bit of context, and I know you've already heard some from Richard, just in the introduction, was that I work for Sealed Air, and Sealed Air is a relatively large manufacturer of packaging solutions around the world. And we see that we're in business to solve critical packaging challenges, to protect, and to make our world better than we found it. And I think from our organization's perspective, it's that word make that's quite important here, in that that's a really reasonably recent change for us, but a great recognition of the fact that no longer is it really about looking after our own backyard and just perhaps inward looking and solving what happens within our four walls. It's really about how can we influence the direction, and how can we help the world generate better outcomes overall. So some of the brands that we're responsible for out there that you might be aware of, Bubble Wrap, for example, is in fact how we get our name Sealed Air. The little bubbles that like to pop, anti-stress device that it is, was invented by a couple of gentlemen who were seeking to create a new application for textured wallpaper somewhere back in the 60s, and ended up inventing bubble wrap, which really was the precursor to building out the capability of long distance movement of goods without damage, and perhaps really paved the way for the e-commerce channels we have today. And of course, here in Australia, we are major net exporters of fresh produce, particularly in the meat industry, and Cryovac is a major brand in that space, producing materials and solutions that enable the world of global trade of meat to travel around. And if you like steak, it's a great way of getting excellent steak to your table. So, COVID times, this is a virtual meeting. And I think, many of us presenting today will probably talk about how we presented in different countries today alone. It has really changed a lot. And what it's brought about with is some changes in the way consumers interact with their supply chains for products. And I'm really going to focus in on food products and packaging today. So we've seen a major shift in channel choice driven by the pandemic. And we've seen that something like 59% of consumers in a recent study we did had tried a new channel during lockdown. And something like 52% of consumers had tried e-commerce for the first time. We were always on the trajectory for more and more people entering the e-commerce space, but this has generated a step change. And they're here to stay. What we found was that while consumers first tested e-commerce as a desire to remain healthy, perhaps a more sanitary approach, not interacting and not being out in public, facilitating those safe outcomes. While post-lockdown, those have stayed, although I say post-lockdown loosely, because here in Melbourne, we're not quite post it just yet. But one of the key factors that people are staying is around the level of convenience it delivers. So e-commerce, for a much wider variety of products, including food, including fresh produce, for a wider slice of the population, is here to stay. And interestingly, through this period, we've seen concerns about food waste continue to rise. All over the world, consumers continue to be concerned about food waste. And so what does all this mean for the future packaging design? Well, here's my really quick model to try and encapsulate the key thoughts I wanted to pass along to you. None of this is new. It's always been here. We've got climate change to consider. We've got the performance and the delivery of all of the outcomes that packaging facilitates. And then, as Jane has been talking about, we need better outcomes and circularity. The kicker to me, though, is we don't just need to do better in one category. We don't just need to do incrementally better in one category or the other. We need to step change all of them. And to do that requires great collaboration across industry and up and down the supply chains. So I think we're in an era now, and it's so exciting because there's drivers for change, there's enthusiasm for change. And I'd say we need to be thinking about how can we step change the triple bottom line of packaging design. It has been and it remains about efficient supply chains. Efficient supply chains are those that consume the least resources, generate the least waste, not just packaging waste, but all kinds of waste along the supply chain. And in that space, packaging is an enabler. So how do we start in this space with design thinking? More and more life cycle, entire supply chain thinking needs to come into place. But I challenge all of us to think about this more widely than we have before. We've been thinking about the waste hierarchy. How do we reduce, reuse, recycle? How do we get better outcomes further up the supply chain? We've been thinking about the resource impacts inbound to our businesses and incrementally improving their efficiency. But impacts during use isn't just through the manufacturing business to business supply chain. Now we've got to think about how do we influence waste at the consumer level. And this is not only about packaging waste, but also food waste. Opportunities like storage, cook-in, access, portioning, reuse of the food that's been cooked, protection, a lot of these impacts are at the household level. And that's important that we are thinking about this as we design the packaging today. Of course, we need to think about the state of the recycling infrastructure we have today, and importantly, what's coming towards us. It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing here, but we really need to be thinking about putting solutions into the market today that are going to be ready and create demand for them to pull through that infrastructure that we really need. So reduce is still the top outcome in that we need to be using less. That facilitates climate change outcomes. And it's about reducing waste in every shape and form. And here, the interesting one I find in discussions is everybody has a slightly different perspective. And I challenge us to step back a moment and think, are we really designing for consumer sentiment, or are we designing for true environmental outcome? What's the objective? And there's a lot of conflicts in that and a lot of misinformation in that space. So as Jane has already talked about, and she mentioned our pre-discussion prior to the session, we talked about the importance of education around what packaging is, what it does, and what do we do with it when it's used. Those are critical. In the essence of time, I'm not going to go through all of this slide, but recently we've been contributing to the work done by FIAL on how do we get Australia to halve food waste by 2030. And look at the numbers at the bottom. A lot of that's at the household. And that's why this expanding our scope of thinking about how do we influence consumer behavior in the household with the education of the packaging and the features of the packaging that we're using in the food supply chain today. We need to be thinking about that up front at the design phase. I just want to illustrate some of my concepts just really quickly with a few examples. And I think this is a fairly common picture that many of us will have seen before. Addressing food waste and addressing waste in total with packaging is about finding that sweet spot that is the right amount of packaging to deliver the protection needed and eliminate waste. So we want to use the minimum packaging solution we can. How do we use less and deliver the results we need? And you can see that shelf life on high value and high resource intense foodstuffs, meat is probably one of the worst examples or greatest examples, if you like, can have a huge impact on the total life cycle analysis. Just a few percent or even parts of a % of additional food waste will lead to much worse total environmental impacts. So that's critical. We've got to do the job well and make sure we have no damage. And then how do we, as I said before, step change innovate so that we're delivering the impacts that we need around circularity and recovery of these materials. And here's an example we're just launching now as an example of the way the future can be delivered in the meat supply chain. So the launch of a recycle ready, recyclable in the Red Cycle program here in Australia, meat shrink bag, but not just meeting the minimum threshold. How do we give Liz and the team at Red Cycle products that are much easier to recycle? If we can clean up that stream, if we can clean the stream, that enables the recyclers to generate higher value, better yield, better outcomes. That makes products more desirable, and more desirable products are easier for them to sell or to recover in the market, and that will drag more packaging in. So this is an example where we're looking at how do we future-proof structures, creating a vacuum barrier shrink bag that has more than 90% polyolefin content and does not include in the soft plastics stream problematic materials like PET and nylon. This is the kind of step change innovation and material structures we need to be working on. And then looking at the supply chain in total, what about waste within the supply chain? I love this example of redesigning equipment so that it can take materials and get 100% utilization of the materials used to pack off during the supply chain. The world has been used to these matrix waste generation, huge rolls of waste generated just as a pure byproduct of running the equipment. Why do we have to do that? We need to be thinking about step changes that can deliver us that kind of zero waste outcome within the supply chain. And another step change thinking, and there are a number of examples of these hitting the shelves now. The traditional way of doing MAP packaging has been to have a tray, a lid film, a soaker pad, and protect the product inside. Soaker pads, once they've been used, have absorbed meat juice, and there just is no recovery path for those. They're always going to end up in landfill, and quite often they're going to take the tray that they're attached to landfill with them. What about if we introduce a tray with smart technology that can hold the juices in the bottom of the tray, giving the consumer the look, feel, safety that they're looking for, and eliminate the pad altogether? We use something like 750 million of these pads a year in Australia. And the release of the Hydrolock program that I just showed you partway through last year already eliminated 2.2 million pads in 2020. And that will grow and grow and grow. We have a mountain of these things we can eliminate. I just like this example because it's taking a wide view of it and saying, what do we really need? Is there a way of us getting rid of this packaging piece altogether? And Jane talked about polystyrene, EPS cases. Well, there are solutions coming as well. And we're very proud actually of a very recent PETA award and WPO, World Packaging Star Award winning pack, TempGuard, using recycled materials and a curbside recyclable fiber-based solution that can replace an EPS tray. Such a great solution dealing with a problematic material that is highly mobile and ends up being quite prevalent in the environment because it's so hard to control. Every time I break up styrene at my place from anything that's delivered here and that, it breaks my heart because it is so hard to control. And I know not everyone's as diligent as controlling it all as I would be. In smart packaging, it offers us opportunity into the future. We've got the opportunity to interact with products and deliver new outcomes, step change outcomes. So smart packaging is really a bunch of different concepts. We can have intelligent packaging that monitors what's going on with the pack inside and can tell us something about it. We can have active packaging, packaging that interacts or modifies the environment or the product that's contained, and connected packaging that allows consumers or the industry to look at what is the product and tells us something about that packaging. This is really a strong opportunity in the future, not only for consumer provenance, looking at what are they purchasing, which is one of the things that's being driven, but also it's a great opportunity to educate consumers about the packaging and what to do with it when it's used or when it's finished its useful life. Where should they put it? How can they recover it? Digital printing is what we need to generate these kinds of solutions. Digital printing enables us to do things that we haven't done before. Creating each pack as an individual identification so that we can understand something more about it and we can control it potentially, or at least measure what happens to it and generate ideas and outcomes that can deliver better outcomes for across the board, including recovery options. It gives us options for variable data, and it gives us options for certainly brand building, one-on-one personalization. And as I mentioned, it opens the window to a new way of thinking about sustainable outcomes, education, monitoring and determining where products are ending up in the supply chain so that we can recover them, sort them, and turn them into the product streams that we need to facilitate better recoveries, better circularity into the future. And a circular economy in direct food contact proteins is arguably one of the hardest places to go. So I want to just show you another example. It's a little like the Kit Kat example in many ways, a commercial running model that's operating in Europe today that we are part of. So last year, Tesco came to us and said, let me just move that forward to there. Oops. Tesco came to us and said, look, we've started collecting packaging and we want to know what to do with it. Much like the Red Cycle program here, they started collecting plastic packaging, flexible packaging back from their consumers. So in combination with Plastic Energy, recycling, an advanced chemical recycling company that we've acquired a position in, we worked with them as a partner, SABIC as the resin refiner and generator, and produced new films for Bradbury's cheese to put back on Tesco's shelves. So a commercial program that's still running in the UK, kicking off in about the middle of last year, is an insight into how direct food contact in protein packaging, arguably one of the most difficult applications, can be done. And it can be done in a circular way, and it does make sense. Hopefully I can move forward slides here. Right. So in summary, we think must-haves in the packaging world are that plastic remains an environmental choice. It has incredible benefits for its lightweight and its ability to deliver low climate change impact outcomes through protection and very low footprint in manufacture. Plastics are challenging, but they can be circular. There are demonstrations and roadmaps and opportunities in place to generate circularity for plastics, but we need more. We need more collection, sorting, and generation of new materials. We really think that leading peer groups, it's going to be increasingly important to tell consumers and retailers why the packaging is there, what it does for them. Embrace consumer recycling labels. Jane talked about it. We're big fans of it. I think that the recycling logo program in Australia is leading, and it's something everyone really should get behind. The more we educate consumers to do the right source separation, the better shape we are into the future. And we all need to measure, demonstrate, and report on the progress we're making on optimizing packaging outcomes. Thank you. Thanks for your time. I think you might still be on mute there, Richard.
Thank you. Yes, I am on mute. People say I sound better that way, but thank you, Alan, for your really thought-provoking and interesting presentation. And the animation was interesting. I think we probably do need to see it again to understand what each individual bit is supposed to be doing. I suppose the question that I would have, and I'll just ask one question, then we'll move on to the next speaker. The Hydrolock technology without the absorbent mats, does the meat taste better? Because it sounds like the juices aren't absorbed on the mat underneath, they're retained within the meat. Is that a selling point for it as well?
Look, I think that that's not tested well enough to demonstrate it, absolutely. But it's clear that the absorbent pads have a very aggressive absorbent powder within them, and they do have a tendency to draw more moisture out of the meat. So yes, I think anecdotally we believe that less moisture is drawn from the meat in the first place. And perhaps without that being drawn and it contained in the way that it is, there may be an improvement in microbial activity as well.
Sounds good. An excellent selling point. Well, look, I think we'll leave it there. We can have further discussion on this topic later on during the panel discussion. But will people now join with me in giving Alan a virtual round of applause for the presentation this evening? Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Good. Our third speaker this evening is Richard Smith, Director of Sustainability for Amcor Flexibles, Asia Pacific. As we all know, Amcor is a very successful multinational company described as a global leader in developing and producing responsible packaging for food, beverage, pharmaceutical, medical, home and personal care products. Many of the goods found on supermarket shelves today are encased and protected in packaging produced by Amcor. Now, Richard is a chemical engineer. He has a degree from the University of Melbourne and has worked in the packaging industry for over 30 years, focused heavily on innovation and enabling customers to become more circular through responsible packaging solutions. In 2013, Richard was made a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Packaging for significant contributions to the development of innovative plastics packaging. And more recently, in 2020, Richard was appointed a non-executive director of APCO. So now let's give Richard a warm virtual welcome as we sit back and enjoy his presentation today. So thank you, Richard.
Thanks for the welcome, Richard. Thanks very much for everyone who's joining us here online today. I'll just get my presentation up. So I'm going to talk about creating recyclable, flexible packaging. And just to set the story straight, when we talk about flexible packaging, it's everything on the right-hand side of the screen that you might be used to, whether it's bread bags or potato chip bags, or even the meat packaging that Alan was talking about, and it's not all the other rigid forms of packaging that you might see there as well. So I'm going to be touching on flexible packaging. And one of the stories about flexible packaging, and Alan was talking to this in some of the discussion he was having around life cycle analysis, is that it's very efficient. When you look at it across other packaging mediums, whether it's the fossil fuel usage, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions, the amount of water that might get used, or even how many empty packs you can get onto a truck being delivered to the factory when it's going to get filled, there's significant benefits that flexible packaging has. And I think that's why in the last 20, 30 years or more, we've seen the rise of flexible packaging against other formats, because it is just so efficient. Obviously, it leads to benefits in terms of things like cost. And that's really one of the paradoxes that we face today about flexible packaging. It's incredibly efficient in that sort of first part of its life and use. It's very lightweight. It's really got great barrier properties. It's very safe for food and medicines that we all wish to enjoy. Brings cost efficiencies through the supply chain, through the value chain, and got that very low carbon footprint. But when it gets to the end of its life, there's really not a lot left. There's minimal mass. And that means there's relatively low value. And we also know we're in an industry that's extraordinarily efficient in producing virgin materials, and they're relatively cost effective. And historically, really, the sort of traditional mechanical recycling systems that have built up, the legacies that we have in Australia, New Zealand, elsewhere, haven't been really built around dealing with this sort of material, because I think really in reality, everyone went after the heavier materials because that had mass, and that therefore had value of material to be able to sell. And this is really the paradox we've got today. But there's really huge potential when you think about that. If you've got a packaging format that's extremely efficient in its use part, if we can transform that flexible packaging to a circular economy, away from the linear economy, we've got a huge opportunity for the environment. And waste is a real issue today that we need to address. You know, we need to move quickly relative to what we see everywhere, and flexibles being and packaging, plastics packaging as well, being in the oceans that we see. I participated in a cleanup day myself just must be over a year ago now, because it was before COVID, but down in Port Melbourne, and you know, there was a lot of plastic just along the foreshore there that we were picking up. So it's not just overseas, it's local as well. The solution to this, though, is that there are really what I would touch on 4 key areas that enable us to address this issue that we see about waste and where it's ending up in the environment. The first part being the packaging and its design. The other element would be the design around our waste collection infrastructure. We've talked about and touched on the collection and the consumer behaviour, and how, for instance, the labelling scheme that we do have through APCO is helping in that space. And there's also, and we've heard from, and we saw the graphics from Alan on advanced recycling, and so the recycling infrastructure to deal with collected materials all need to come into play. And this is what, particularly on the design side, is really what led back in 2018 for Amcor to really focus around making our global pledge, which was that by 2025, all of our packaging would be recyclable or reusable. We would significantly increase the use of recycled materials in our packaging, and we'd obviously work across the supply chain to drive a greater recycling of packaging. And really the opportunity exists in all economies. We've heard before about the national packaging targets. These are the targets in terms of recycled content. And we heard before that we're looking for 50% across all packaging by 2025. When you break that out into plastics, we're looking to try to get to 20% recycled content by 2025. And we've looked specifically into flexibles. When this measurement was taken, it was really a bit unknown how much recycled content we had. I'd read that at more or less as 0. And, you know, we've now see a target for 10%, which is fantastic. But we've got very low levels of post-consumer recycled content today in our packaging. And it's not just in other economies overseas. It exists right here in Australia that we need to address this. Amcor's working closely across the supply chain and across the value chain to try to reduce plastic waste. And we're working across the sphere of influencing product design standards and working with organisations locally, such as APCO, working with other organisations like CFlex, through the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We're working on elements to how to promote recycling infrastructure, and that's working with organisations like the Plastics Pact that we heard before, but also with other organisations like the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And we're encouraging, obviously, consumer participation, being very supportive here in the Australia, New Zealand context with the Red Cycle programs and the soft plastics recycling program in New Zealand, and other organisations like the Consumer Goods Forum. One of those projects that came out underneath the Ellen MacArthur Foundation was Project Barrier, and I thought I'd touch on that relative to flexibles. It was led actually by one of my colleagues in Amcor Europe, but it was a value chain program with many different partners that you can see here on the screen. And the projects was about establishing design guidelines for flexible packaging to ensure that they're of a design that means they can actually be recycled when collected. And you can see on the screen the sorts of guidelines that have been established and accepted. And we, as Amcor, prioritise ourselves towards these guidelines. In fact, we measure ourselves in every business unit around the world relative to these guidelines. And we will always, of course, respect local guidelines if they exist, but if they're not there, then we default to these guidelines. And what these basically point out is that reality is we need to redesign our flexible packaging such that it's more towards polyolefins, and even more preferably towards mono structures, whether it's monopolypropylene or monopolyethylene. But we can see also on the third line there that it's been cited really that to aid the recycling of flexibles, we really need to eliminate problematic materials like PVC, like PVDC, aluminium foil and PET, and try to restrict other polymers as well, such as EVOH, nylon, and so forth. And the exceptions to these can be granted, but it's through doing preferred work through people like Cyclos, HTP, or RACI class, and protocols that exist to enable you to make valued assessments of packaging and whether it can actually be recycled. And why are these guidelines so important from my perspective and for all of us to understand is that historically, as I touched on before, we've had mechanical recycling in many economies, but we're also seeing the emergence of advanced recycling. Chemical recycling type processes is one of those. And what we understand through the sort of work that we've been doing is with our supply chain partners is that without these guidelines, or materials that do not comply to these sorts of guidelines, have serious impacts on both mechanical recycling and advanced or chemical recycling of flexibles. So if we really want to ensure the efficiency and the most highest value outcomes from these sorts of recycling processes, then the sort of design guidelines from Project Barrier are absolutely crucial. Chemical recycling, as we've heard, has been able to provide benefits beyond normal mechanical recycling, and this is very much so the case for flexible packaging. Historically, mechanical recycling has been really good to provide outcomes for PET bottles and HDPE bottles, and in fact there are processes proven to be able to provide food grade materials for those sorts of applications. When we get into the complexities of flexible packaging, What we can see is that without advanced recycling, without being able to move materials back to polymers, back to resins, and then back into new films, we're not able to produce films that are food grade approved. And so the real benefit that we see in industry, and this is why these technologies are emerging so quickly, is that we can see the highest possible use of collected materials, and that has been able to go right back into the food packaging that it originally came from. As Alan touched on before as well, what's incredibly important when we assess these sorts of outcomes is to use life cycle analysis. Amcor, we have a tool called Asset that enables it to make those sorts of assessments, and we utilize this tool whenever we make a change to packaging and assess, where we're moving and what sort of design changes we're making. We certainly make sure we do this to ensure that our customers and other people in the supply chain can actually make valued assessments of the sort of changes that they're considering. Just to give you some examples of some of this work, when we think about those design guidelines from Project Barrier, and this is some of the innovation work that Amcor has been undertaking. An example here now of a commercialized microwavable pouch that enables shelf-stable product. Now, if you've been around in the packaging industry for a while, you'll understand that a retortable pouch and something that is for a product that's going to be on shelf maybe for a year or so is an incredibly demanding package. And it's historically been made from many different materials, making it historically a non-recyclable package, now made from polyolefins with all the actual technology for barrier that's required and can withstand the retort process. So it's an amazing step change. And I think for myself personally, been around in industry for a long time, if we can make this sort of change here, we can make any packaging recyclable. We've also seen here in Australia more recently the move by brands to move away from using fossil-based plastics and move to paper, which is fine. And they've seen great engagement with customers and consumers, being able to return their packaging back into the paper stream and have that recycled in that format. And as we've seen and heard before around the Kit Kat exercise, this was a collaboration across the supply chain that helped to really demonstrate here in the Australian context that in fact, if we all work collaboratively together across the supply chain, we can actually establish recycled content that is product safe for our favorite food and brands, and ensure the circularity of flexible packaging. And I think this has been a great demonstration of what is possible and actually what's to come here in Australia and around the world. But that's not just with food, we're seeing changes as well in healthcare packaging. We've always obviously want our medicines to be safe, to be usable when we receive them. Historically, pharma type products have been packed with PVC, and here what we see Amcor doing is moving away from that material and enabling it to be used to be packaged in polyolefin based structures, and to also ensure as well that we design in all the features that we normally expect, such as child resistance and being senior friendly. I think what we can see here is there's a huge amount of innovation coming through industry. I mean, from us, from Amcor, we're very committed to working collaboratively across the supply chain such that we can develop our packaging, particularly in flexibles, that's going to be reusable and or recyclable, and definitely about increasing our use of recycled content. And I'm very excited about that. And so thanks for the opportunity to talk tonight.
Thank you, Richard. There we go. Thank you, Richard, for a most provoking and interesting presentation. You talked about collaboration. I think that is, we've seen that as being one of the keys to solving many of the problems. We have time now for some discussion. We have another question from an anonymous attendee, and specifically a question to you, Richard. You mentioned food waste very briefly. Are there any initiatives targeting the reduction of food waste at the household level? You able to comment on that?
I think that, and Alan touched on this as well. We're all leading very busy lives, and there's a requirement for us to have convenience. We're looking also for new elements about our food. Certainly what I think we're seeing is that portion control. And it may actually mean, to a degree, you might think, well, that may actually increase the amount of packaging being used. And that's possible. But obviously with the work that's happening on the ability to have our materials being recyclable and recycled, then we should be able to address those issues. And at the same time, we're seeing a smaller amount of people in households, faster lives. So those elements around portion control is just one example is happening. I think what we're also seeing is, and it's really interesting, we're seeing a drive towards wanting to have our packaging be recyclable. And we've dealt with historic structures before over a long period of time, but now that challenge to industry about how do we change the packaging, how do we make it recyclable, is actually introducing newer technologies, such as I showed in that microwavable pouch. And the work that we know that we've done with that pouch is, in fact, that the barrier in that pouch is actually better than anything we had before. So the shelf life is actually improved, and therefore the ability to have food waste is actually improved. So there's, I'm sure there's myriad of examples of that we could find across industry.
Okay. Thanks, Richard. Bill Verhagen has got a couple of comments here, questions. Richard, again addressed to Richard, with your various collaborations, when do Amcor realistically see chemical recycling of flexibles operating at scale? And I guess he means commercial scale in Australia.
I'd love to see it here in a couple of years' time.
A couple of years' time. So you think that you'd reach the national packaging target calling for 70% recycled in 2025?
I think that the target for across the industry, I think, yes, we'll achieve that. Plastics, I think we'll achieve, there's going to be very challenging. Flexibles, I think we're going to be having a very strong challenge to reach that 10% level. But, that's why you have goals, that's where we're going to drive ourselves towards. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward right at that challenge right now.
Comment in the chat from Neil Whelan to all panelists. Has the overall environmental pollution aspect of paper boxes been compared to that of non-paper packages? Now, that's something I think for everyone to think about if we're looking at paper as an alternative to plastics. So who'd like to kick off? Alan, Jane, or Richard? Who's going to start?
Maybe I can just share something quickly. And it's not often that we see direct comparisons independently assessed and put into the market that are so close to home for us. So in New Zealand Post was looking into what would be the best outcome for a typical courier satchel. And they evaluated recycled content from two sources, domestically made New Zealand or offshore production. They evaluated compostable plastic offering as well as to paper-based offerings. And the numbers are pretty staggering. And I don't think this is unexceptional for comparing flexible plastics with cardboard or fiber-based solutions or alternatives. So versus the standard traditional courier satchel, as you think of it today, made 100% virgin, a high recycled content option could get the greenhouse gas emissions carbon footprint to about 50% at best operating, while fiber-based alternatives were going to be between 8 and 13 times the carbon footprint. And that's numbers from an independent, and it's publicly available stuff. And this is not uncommon because typically the performance of plastic is so good that the weight of packaging we have to go to in other categories to match the performance tends to give us a pretty heavy resource footprint. I'll let the others have a crack. That was my couple of comments.
I might add into that, if I may, Richard. I think one of the areas that I've seen these sorts of comparisons done is particularly in the space of plastic bags versus paper bags versus calico bags, reusable bags, things like that. I think what we see is that from a life cycle assessment perspective, the paper always comes off worse against plastics in terms of the inputs of material into the system. They really are much higher. When you think about things like, well, again, and it depends on how far we go back down the supply chain to the production of raw materials. But yeah, paper is notoriously worse for that. I think if we look at that question, though, in terms of environmental pollution, paper has a higher propensity to break down more quickly. But we're also seeing a lot of complications coming into the fiber market these days around things like wet strengthening, polymer coatings and things like that are problematic, not just in an environmental perspective if they escape into the litter stream, but also in terms of reprocessing those materials coming through fiber recovery. So there are some challenges going on there in terms of people trying to move away from plastics because and we go back to Alan's point about consumer perception on some of these things. People want to move away from plastic, so they go for something like paper or fiber because they think it is more accepted by the consumer, but then they do things to make it behave like plastic, which causes the same sorts of problems in the long term, and we don't end up in a better place in any way, shape or form. So I think they're the kind of considerations that people need to understand when they're making these sorts of decisions.
I'll get off mute. Do you have any comments, Richard, you'd like to add to that, to the discussion?
Oh, no, I think that Jane and Alan have answered it very well.
One of the things that I sort of get a bit annoyed about is the amount of packaging used on non-food and non-pharmaceutical things, such as I'm a grandfather now, you see, so I go and look in toy shops, and it is amazing the amount of plastic, probably all imported, that toys seem to be wrapped up in, and this is crazy, isn't it? What can we do about packaging for things which don't really need packaging? Do we have any thoughts about that?
Perhaps I can weigh in that one in terms of the design side of things. That's certainly some of the work that we try to do with our brand owners in terms of optimizing their packaging, reducing the amount of materials. We work with the waste hierarchy that we were looking at again in Alan's presentation there. And the first step of that is to reduce. And in terms of our sustainable packaging guidelines, the sort of instructional guidance that we give to our members about improving their sustainability in packaging, that is the very first step in the process. Some of the challenges that we face are with businesses that are importing, as you say, but we are also working very hard to get people to engage with their supply chains, to have those conversations with importers that are bringing materials in, to make sure that they're thinking about these issues as well and understanding what the limitations and the opportunities are in the Australian marketplace. So yeah, certainly a priority for us.
Richard, can I add just a really quick comment there? To me, this is a great example of education, and I know it's been a consistent theme today. Unfortunately, consumers' perception of products is enhanced by robust, sizable, and quality printed packaging, typically. It's generally tested. The thicker and more rigid the packaging is versus flimsy and thin, we tend to associate quality with that, unfortunately. This is why education is just so critical. We can get consumers to make a good decision around packaging and understand the decision if they know why it's there and we take them on the journey. If we just confront them without any education with two options and they're going to buy a toy, one's in a beautiful glossy pack showing it off and looks well protected, the other one's kind of thin, maybe doesn't look quite as robust and is nice to as an appearance, what kind of result are we expecting? We've got to take consumers on the journey with us.
Yes. Do we have to educate the children or the parents and grandparents who are actually making the purchasing decision?
I think we also have to educate the marketers. They don't seem to often figure in a lot of these planning processes, and to bring them along the journey to be able to articulate the choices in packaging to the consumer, I think are very important. They're a very important voice in that space too.
Now, can I ask any of the other panelists if they'd like to make a contribution?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I'll put my question to Jane. Thank you. One of your slides mentioned one of your outcomes or your targets is to standardise curb collection and things like that. I mean, that topic's been raised in a few of our earlier episodes about how inconsistent it is across Australia, and there's so many local governments and councils involved. How do you see that? What's the biggest challenge for you in that objective? You know, can it work?
Sure, Gary. Yeah, look, I think a big part of that is, you know, every council negotiates its own local waste contracts, and it has relationships with its waste companies, and they are very unique kinds of contracts generally. And we find that the same company can be servicing two councils adjacent to one another and offering different services based on the sort of budgets that the councils have available in their coffers to spend on these services. What we would like to see and what we're trying to work towards is, again, it's an education thing with local government authorities to understand, I guess, the challenges that those inconsistencies cause, not just from the waste handling company's perspective, but from a consumer perspective. Some councils do, some councils don't. How do we know consumers aren't inclined to just jump on a website and have a look when they're trying to work out whether or not they should put something in their yellow bin? So from that perspective, it's a collaborative conversation. We're in the process at the moment of putting together a local government forum specifically to have these kind of conversations, and we want to bring the waste companies to the table in that situation as well, to, I guess, let local government understand the challenges as well as the waste companies hear from local government in terms of what they're dealing with. So again, it's that approach where we need to get everybody together so that each can hear the pinch points and the pain points that the other has, and it just brings that you know, collaborative approach to trying to resolve the situation, I think, and that I think is you know, making that a level playing field will make it easier for everybody.
And are you getting a good amount of support from government in terms of this objective? Because, you know, it's very honourable for you guys to be taking on the leadership role here, when perhaps, you know, you could expect the government maybe should be doing the job.
Yeah, well, I mean, we work with local government the authorities themselves, but we also work with LGAs, and you know, we've got the state-based entities, and we're also close to the Australian Local Government Association as well. So we utilise those sort of relationships that we have to have these conversations. And I think, again, you know, there's an increasing awareness coming around this stuff. I keep saying to people, I feel like I'm at the beginning of a revolution. There's this massive change that's going on. I can see it starting to happen, and I can see people waking up as we go along. Just the way the rhetoric's changing, and you know, some of the examples we were talking about before we came online earlier, you know, it's being embedded in the KPIs of CEOs and things like that across the country, and being fed down into the bodies of organisations. And they're the sorts of changes I think that perhaps local government hasn't really cottoned onto yet, but they're starting to. And we're seeing, you know, people like the regional organisations, the councils here in Sydney, some of those guys are getting together and having those conversations amongst themselves without even us coming to the party. They're doing it because they're recognising the benefits that they can gain from doing that sort of thing. So again, it's an emerging process, and I think we're going to see a lot more change happen as we go down the line. You know, consistency around things like green waste collections and organic food waste collections, those sorts of things starting to come into play as well. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Could I react on that? This is Jean-Michel speaking. In general, I mentioned earlier, I think here also, that government intervention once in a while is helpful. And not everybody likes that. I realize that too. But I believe that particularly in the supply chain, some standardization will be helpful in making things happen. And I'm confident enough in technology development over time that people will be able to escape out of that in a proper way, but then with better solutions. And we need to remember that normally developments, certainly based on chemical products, they take often 10, 20 years. So what APCO has set as targets for us to reach in 2025 is challenging and not all the time impossible, but I hope there will be some leniency and say, hey, maybe the development takes a bit longer, but we will reach those targets at a later time. And I'm convinced that that will happen. Convinced that we will reach the targets, I mean. Yeah, it might only take a bit more time. And Richard has also already mentioned that earlier. We must be patient because industry is really doing its best to make things happen. And I think if we all understand that, then we make a step forward.
And I think Han just setting those targets has spurred so much momentum.
I agree. The advantage is that we have targets. It is not a final figure. Yeah, it is a target. And targets are there to aspire to. And not all the time we must be there already. It is the aspiration. And that is what we see happening currently in our industry in Australia. All of a sudden, everybody starts to work together and moving in the right direction. So I think we make great progress. So also thanks to APCO, by the way.
Yeah, thanks, Han, for that. So for those comments, I think everyone would agree with those. Are there any other comments? I think we seem to have lost Richard for the moment, but not sure whether he's left or... Bill Verhagen has asked another question in the context of the national packaging targets, calling for 70%. No, I think we just answered that. Hang on, let me see if I can just look this. Yes, sorry, a new question from Keith Chesel. Sorry about that. To Richard, what further opportunities, like Braskem, do you see coming through that will provide renewable resource flexible plastics that will be able to be recycled? Now, Richard, can you answer that, do you think?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I dropped out before, but I'm back online.
I just noticed that you disappeared and I wondered, had we said anything? Was it something, because it was something we said?
So thanks for the question from Keith. So certainly renewable materials, and these are not necessarily materials that are recycled materials, but materials that are sourced from resources that are grown. And for argument's sake, the Braskem material that Keith references comes from sugarcane grown in Brazil, converted into ethanol and then converted to ethylene and polyethylene. Those sorts of materials, I think, will continue to expand in use. I think there's a degree of challenge with some of these materials as well, and you'll see it in other organisations' reports as well, where there's concerns around arable land, deforestation. There are some organisations that would suggest that we have already reached our or even surpassed our limits of use of land for non-food applications and even for food applications. So, you know, I suppose if I had my wish, those sorts of renewable materials would be made in a vessel by smart chemical engineers. But you know, no doubt we will begin to. We are seeing a move away and a desire to move away from fossil-based materials, such that we restrict the amount of, you know, use of fossil-based carbon and potential for global warming and so forth. But I think they will grow. My preference really is to move back to and move towards recycled feedstocks that we've been, you know, touching on for advanced recycling. I think it'd be more my preference for the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a couple of minutes to 9 o'clock, and we said that we'd finish at 9 o'clock. So I think it's probably time to call a halt to the discussions. I'd like all our participants in the webinar this evening to thank the presenters again for most thought-provoking, stimulating and entertaining addresses. So thank you, Jane, Richard and Alan, for your presentations. I know that Yvonne will be contacting you separately to more formally express our thanks for your participation today. So thank you again. The next webinar in the Plastics Frontiers series will be held on Tuesday, July the 27th at 7:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Time, and that'll be after the school holidays. And Dr. Yvonne Ma from the RACI and chair of the organising committee will be chairing the session. And the overall theme will be Roadmap to a Sustainable Economy. And that's just there on your screen that you can see there. So again, thank you to our very generous sponsors, BASF, Reckitt Benckiser, Qenos and Foundry Intellectual Property. Is there anything more that I need to say, Yvonne?
Oh, good.
We think we've done it. Wrap up. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for participating in tonight's webinar. And on behalf of our committee, good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Cheerio.
Hi, everyone.